Right. Time to start. Hi, everyone. My name is Khadija Richards. I'm a program manager at Wits RHI, the GPP program. That's also part of the AVAC CASPA program. We'd like to welcome Professor Lee Fairlee. She's our Director of Maternal and Child Health. Imelda Mahaka, who is the Country Director of the Pangaea Zimbabwe AIDS Trust, and Ntando Yola, who is the Community Engagement Lead at the Desmond Tutu Health Foundation. From Wits RHI and AVAC, welcome to this webinar, and we look forward to hosting the safe space for you to continue a very interesting debate in the Research Literacy Networking Zone on the inclusion of pregnant and breastfeeding women in trials. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Khadija. Thank you very much. I think you should have entered us with the music because I see a keyboard behind you. That would have been nice because everybody, this is the networking zone, as Khadija has said, and thanks to Wits RHI and the leadership of Melissa for bringing us together in this research networking zone as part of IAS 2021 conference. And we're really going to leave a lot of time actually for us to discuss all of this. We're really happy. We have about 60, almost 70 people as part of this discussion, which really highlights how important this conversation that we're going to have here is. And as Khadija has told us, we have people who are very close to this conversation who are going to talk to us, you know, from Professor Fairlee and Imelda, who have already been introduced, which I think is helpful because we do not have to spend a lot of time introducing them, but they're working very closely to the matter. So we're very excited to have them because what brings us today in this networking zone is because PrEP as an HIV prevention tool is one of the breakthroughs we have come to experience and celebrate, and very excited about it actually in our lifetime, because a lot of other interventions that are needed, very much needed for HIV prevention, are really seem to be taking a lot longer. But thanks to the breakthroughs around ARVs that can be used for HIV prevention, from oral PrEP to injectable PrEP and the vaginal ring. In fact, we have a lot more that is being promised in the pipeline through research. Now, whilst we're celebrating that we have PrEP, I think almost 10 years now that we have this pill that can be taken on a daily basis, and now we had the ring, and it was followed by injectable PrEP. One of the questions that remained is, can one who is a pregnant woman or a breastfeeding woman take PrEP? And there's been a lot of discussion, and in fact, the World Health Organization has provided some of the guidelines around this. But I think it's still as important that we still continue to have a conversation around this in the midst of this, so that we understand more, because as communities, the best way to understand things is to really have this conversation. And thanks to the Research Networking Zone alongside IAS conference for us to talk about this. So we'll just go right into it and start with Prof. Fairlee and hear from her. Initially, we had, there was a very clear message about the fact that, women who are breastfeeding and women who are pregnant cannot take PrEP, and that has changed. Please take us through briefly why that changed, and what has changed, and in fact, what are some of the things that communities need to be mindful of around ensuring that now PrEP can be taken. In fact, most importantly, is that one of the things that we didn't know is, in fact, that became an issue, is that the participants who participated in a lot of the trials that I have mentioned had not, if they were pregnant and if they were breastfeeding initially, they had to be taken out of the trials, and that didn't give us data, in terms of understanding what really happens and what are the implications. But now that has changed, and would like to hear from you, Prof, about that. Thank you.
Thanks, Ntando. And so it's still complicated. Unfortunately, it's not always, you know, as easy as just including all pregnant women in studies. So but maybe, I mean, you're quite right. The dilemma then that, you know, clinicians and practitioners get faced with is that a product becomes available for non-pregnant women, but then we don't have any information about pregnant women, and it obviously leaves us very, very much on the back foot. And so one of the things that we just need to think through about pregnant women, and you know, the things that we can't completely discard, even though the field has certainly moved, is that, you know, obviously we do still need to make sure that whatever product we're wanting to study in women, or we're wanting to roll out in pregnant women, will be safe in pregnant women. And so the main things that we actually look at is we look at safety, you know, for the woman and her unborn fetus, also safety around the delivery, and then, you know, safety for the infants. We also know that the drug levels or the pharmacokinetics in pregnant women, especially in the second and particularly the third trimester, change. So we often find that there are lower drug levels towards the end of pregnancy, and obviously that can impact the actual efficacy or how well the actual drug works. And then the other thing that we always just need to think about, although is very, very difficult, especially at the earlier stages of research, to get information on, teratogenicity. And I think the problem with teratogenicity or any birth defects or harm to the infant in the early stages of pregnancy, which cause the infant to be born with an abnormality, those things are always very kind of high profile, big ticket items, and I think they often get a lot of press, potentially. I'm not saying more than they should, but they can often derail, you know, efforts sometimes to actually include women in research. And you're quite right, like there are many studies that have insisted that women who join these studies should be on double contraception, and so although the field has moved, I think, you know, I've been lucky enough to be part of a WHO and impact sort of webinar forum and discussion group where a lot of this has really been discussed. And I think that although people are certainly not saying, right, we're just going to enroll all pregnant women in studies, there has to be a more progressive stepwise approach. And so a lot of the thoughts around this are really that we do need some preclinical data, especially around reproductive, so animals, unfortunately, that are pregnant, or, you know, kind of looking at whether there are any signals for abnormalities much earlier than is currently happening. Once we have a reasonable amount of safety and dosing data, and there's no reason to think that there should be a major concern in pregnant women. If women do become pregnant while they are on a clinical trial, for example, they should be given the opportunity to continue with that study. Obviously, they do need to be aware of any risks, and they need to re-sign informed consent, but to potentially continue with the study. And then the next stage would actually be either actively including women in a separate group, or including women as part of a phase 3 study. And then I think, you know, certainly as I mentioned around the teratogenicity or the birth abnormalities, the problem is that information, because you actually need a large number of kind of safety events collected, a lot of the time that is actually done in the post-marketing stage. So once the drug's actually rolled out, that's actually the only time that we can really get a lot of that information. So certainly the field is shifting. And it's becoming a lot more progressive, but there are still kind of steps in place that need to be followed. But certainly there's a huge call for those steps coming earlier, and a far more active move to get this information on women a lot quicker.
Oh, thank you very much, Prof. That's quite a bit, and we're welcoming everybody who's just joined us after we started. This is a conversation on PrEP, and in fact, enrolling women who are breastfeeding or who are pregnant in PrEP trials, and what it is that actually we need to be mindful of. In fact, what is an important reason and justification for us to add and in fact to enroll and push the agenda of ensuring that these women are part of the trials. We've just heard from Prof. Fairlee as part of this, and again, as we are speaking, please, all of you feel free to be part of this engagement and ask questions. There's a chat box for you. There's a hand that you can raise. There's a question and answer component around this. Prof is telling us that the field is really shifting because of a lot of data that is coming through to really address this issue and a lot of things that we are now understanding with regards to this. We're going to go quickly to Imelda, who actually was part of the IS satellite, because the conference has been happening since Sunday this week. So Imelda, you were part of the session on Sunday on informed choices for pregnant women, new approaches and good practices for studying antiretrovirals in pregnancy. So, and I think we'll take your perspectives from that, and in fact, and many other perspectives. And again, just before the call, we're congratulating Zimbabwe because one of the products that we know works for HIV prevention is the dapivirine vaginal ring. Imelda, do you have any initial thoughts around this discussion, and maybe from some of the things that Prof has highlighted in her opening remarks?
Hi, Ntando. Yes, thank you. I think just to take on from what Professor Lee has just said, we do happen to be a part of this WHO Impact initiative. I think in the past, researchers have not always engaged community or women or pregnant women for that matter in these discussions around involving them earlier in clinical trials, which is where I think we then came in as part of community to be able to engage with researchers, donors, ethicists, and the developers of the drugs to see how we can fast forward this movement or this agenda of engaging pregnant and breastfeeding women earlier in trials. What I do want to say is that while there's some momentum that has been gained in the past few years, I feel that there's still a bit of reluctance from I'll give you an example. In one of the meetings that we had, we had one researcher interrupt us, and this is a really well-recognized, distinguished researcher who felt the need to interrupt us and say to the women who were represented in the panel that they didn't understand the implications of being enrolled in trials earlier because again of the issues that were just raised by Professor Lee around the teratogenicity, which was very offensive because it was a 2-day meeting where everyone was literally talking about the same thing, that we need to engage women earlier. But when the community came in to emphasize and add on their voice to say, yes, we do agree, what we want is we want to be given enough information to make an informed decision, he felt the need to interrupt and literally just brush the community aside, which was very offensive. So I just wanted to highlight that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to get as many people on board with this initiative. So I think the critical thing to highlight is that pregnant women are interested in participating in clinical trials. I think that people should just understand that. And I think we want to highlight that women should be at the heart of this agenda. Women are not a niche or a special population. We are the population. There's a quotation that I love that was raised, but I'm not sure who it was during our meeting, to say women should be protected through and not by research. So there are ways, I believe, from the discussions that we've been having, where there are innovative study designs that can be employed, still safeguarding women's safety and the fetus. And I think, there's a place where there's room for engagement of community of pregnant women, so that they understand what they're getting into and make an informed choice. So without inclusion, women will still get the drugs anyway in an uncontrolled and unconsented way, which is why the issue of thalidomide was raised. It was not within a research setting, but I think that is what prompted most of the reluctance of researchers to engage women earlier in clinical trials. So there is need.
Right, and I think,
Communities, CSOs, and pregnant women around these issues to ensure that there's aside from just the consent, but there's understanding from both groups from the start.
Yeah.
I will pause here.
No, great, thank you, Imelda. I love it. Women should be protected through and not by research. And I'm sure, Professor, you agree, and hopefully we're happy to have researchers like you who actually do not imply that actually women should just be participants, and actually they should not have a voice as part of these trials. And in fact, as the people who are the most affected by the work that is done through research. Prof, again, through you, and you had touched a little bit on risk and benefits of exclusion and the inclusion of women in research. I think Imelda has made a very strong case around this. Again, we would like to encourage everybody, like as we continue, it is literally a research networking zone. Research literacy networking zone, all your questions, it is informal. It's a pity that we're doing it virtually, but I think it's still good because we are able to have as many as possible to be part of the conversation. So please go ahead, use the chat box in front of you and the question and answer, as well as you can raise your hand. We are happy to hear your voice. So Prof, please take us through again around the risk and benefits that really need to be considered as part of the call, actually, that Imelda is putting through around this. I see that Awelani has their hand up, and we will give them an opportunity to speak. Over to you, Professor Fairlee.
Thanks, Ntando. And I really think, just to completely support what Imelda has said, it's absolutely essential to include the community, have a community voice. And I heard you mentioning the MTN 042 Deliver study, which I'm actually one of the co-chairs for that study. And certainly that study, we wouldn't have been able to move forward as successfully without the help of community and other stakeholders, and certainly we had the opportunity to engage with community, right from the word go, in actually being able to form the whole proposal, and it really was wonderful, because obviously, pregnant women or women who've been pregnant or women who understand, what some of the potential barriers may be, it's absolutely essential to have women on board to actually make sure that these important studies go forward. So in terms of some of the risks, as I've mentioned, I guess the risks are what we have to know from the research is that or from the drug, is that unless we consider, for example, a drug to be life-saving, we have to make sure that the benefits, obviously, for the mother and the infant, actually outweigh any potential risks. And so obviously this, usually this wouldn't be the case in a PrEP situation. I think that's in some situations where, say, for example, we had a woman who is living with HIV with very sort of complicated resistance patterns, etc., or has got potentially MDR, TB, and those get into very, very tricky situations in terms of risk and benefit. But for PrEP, I think we have to acknowledge that particularly in areas in the world such as sub-Saharan Africa, pregnancy and the postpartum period actually carry tremendous risk for women in terms of HIV acquisition. And so certainly considering a safe PrEP drug or kind of therapy for those women is really very, very important. And so obviously, you know, long gone are the days where any woman on a PrEP study can be randomized to a placebo. Thank goodness. We now know that they are very effective. There's very effective and safe or prevention options, and so certainly, you know, women these days would be randomized to a product that we know actually does work. So certainly that would be a benefit. Of course, we always have to consider, you know, that some products might have slightly less benefit than others, and women need to also understand those risks around a potential PrEP product. And so the benefit, obviously, again, you know, is that there's an element there of protection against HIV. Benefits of being included in research is that we actually then have good, accurate information on the product being used in pregnancy, and we're not just rolling out that product hoping for the best, but actually not having available information around the product. You know, obviously there are additional benefits to being part of a clinical trial for women, and you know, these may be kind of perceived as incentives, but I think many women also enjoy the more frequent study visits that they have on a study, and easy access to healthcare, and then also more frequent HIV testing potentially, which they may not always be able to get in a clinical environment. I think there are actually many other benefits. Maybe just to touch on the particular risks that we look at. And so I think when we're looking at risk, one of the very valuable things is to have good data per country, and actually even if you've got it more accurately to the particular area where you're going to be doing the study, is having good baseline pregnancy outcome information. And so actually, you know, including the pregnant woman, the infant, and actually the pregnancy outcome, and that information is steadily becoming more and more available, because, you know, obviously when you're doing a study like this when you're doing PrEP studies in pregnancy, you want to have something to compare to, because what can happen otherwise is that, you know, the study could be derailed if there's a perception that a particular incident is of a higher risk in a PrEP study, you know, compared to the general population. So that is very helpful to have available. So that's generally, you know, around the safety risks. As I've mentioned, the other risk that can happen is that because we know that the drug levels can go down, the actual efficacy may diminish, and we have to just be aware of that risk. And then, of course, as you mentioned, teratogenicity, and then all the kind of the minor risks that might be involved in any study, which are fortunately quite rare and unusual.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Prof. And I think we continue. There's really a lot around what we are hearing, especially in terms of the risks and benefits, and in fact, why this really should be happening to ensure that we have as much data that is needed for all of the interventions that we get. So this is the research literacy networking zone. We're talking about inclusion of pregnant and breastfeeding women in prevention research. We have panelists, but we also have you all who are part of this conversation. And like Mbali has done, as well Awelani. I don't know, Awelani, if they have dropped their hand because their question has been answered, but let's hand it over to Mbali. And in the meantime, please do like Nontsikelelo, Jean, Nita, Vincent have done to write your remarks on the chat box or even your questions as we continue around this very important conversation. Let us hear from you, Mbali. Well, whilst we're trying to unmute Mbali, all right, there we have Mbali. Hello, Mbali, what is your question? Mbali, if you're speaking, you're on mute.
Oh, hi.
Hey.
Can you hear me? Yes. So, my thinking is, since there were already medication or drugs that were administered to pregnant women, particularly the one that is used during pregnancy where the mom is pregnant, and there wasn't any red flags or whatnot, because that also assisted in terms of making sure that the babies were born uninfected with the HIV. What were the processes that were done to ensure that that process was followed and was passed? Can't clinical trials follow those processes, because it's something that is done and kids are being saved through that? You know what I mean? So I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if
No, that's very clear. That's
yeah.
very clear, Mbali, and I'm sure Prof and anyone else can help us in the sense that we know about PMTCT. We know it's a program that is working. We know that it is ARV. So what is the difference between PrEP and PMTCT in terms of the implications for the unborn baby? Prof, hold it there. Let us hear from Awelani so that we can take those questions at once. Over to you, Awelani. Please make sure that you unmute.
Oh, hi. No, my question was answered. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you. Prof, PrEP. And whilst you are unswitching, I think let's quickly take Likwa. Please unmute Likwa. We cannot really hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, a little far, but let's try and see if we can.
Hello?
Yes, Likwa, we can hear you.
Yes, yes, yes. I think it's what I just said. I think it is a very important matter. Other than us trying to kind of like rediscover ways and try to go about this, I think one of the best ways to kind of like look at how the HIV pills that are used for preventing HIV transmission during the birth, how were they administered? And then we try to kind of like follow that same framework in integrating PrEP and all these medicines that we try to invent and integrate into our communities. So I think it's also a matter of us going back to what has been done, what was done wrong, what was done right. How can we, as organizations, as pharmaceutical industries, as development practitioners, as community development practitioners, how can we learn from what has been done? And from what has been done, how can it be integrated?
We got it,
what is currently being done?
Wonderful. Yes. What can we learn from the past and use what we've learned from the past?
And also, I feel like also cultural norms also play a part. For example, you know the fragility of the matter of pregnancy, especially when we're looking at the Black communities. You know, it's a very fragile matter. So for a woman to participate in such clinical trials, what do you think the study has to address? So for
Great.
me, it's also a matter of us culturally aligning ourselves.
We got it, Likwa. We got it. Thank you very much. Very, very important considerations that we need to have around cultural considerations, learning from the past. Prof, over to you.
Thanks very much for those questions and points. And you're quite right. I mean, I think that a lot of the PMTCT lessons have actually been taken into prep, and of course, some of the sort of early formative oral prep work was really, I guess, based on exactly what we knew about using antiretrovirals to prevent mother-to-child transmission in women who were living with HIV. And so, steadily, of course, there was some sort of variability in data, but essentially people felt, yes, that particularly oral prep, so Truvada was safe and certainly could be taken forward into prep. And so I think that there are studies. So just to mention that a lot of the data that I think we do have around safety, it was actually gleaned from some of the prep demonstration projects. So basically, where women who were enrolled in these studies actually then became pregnant and were continued on the studies. There are other studies that are sort of more purposefully looking at oral prep in pregnant women, and I know that there have been some studies in South Africa led by Diamudli from Caprisa, and then also the Impact 2009 study is specifically looking at this question of oral prep in pregnant and breastfeeding women, and then obviously in their infants. The Deliver study, which is looking at the dipivirine ring in pregnant women, is slightly different, obviously, because we haven't gleaned that from PMTCT, but obviously there were a number of very large dipivirine ring studies, and in fact the design around the Deliver study is to actually start with the lowest risk time in pregnancy first, so women really at the very end of their pregnancy, and then in a stepwise manner look earlier on in pregnancy to eventually include women from just after the first trimester upwards. And so all of those studies use either oral prep as a comparator compared with an additional product. So obviously the dipivirine ring, but obviously each study design might be slightly different. But that is the general principle. I also know that some of the long-acting injectables, the studies are looking very carefully at the long-term, well, the pregnancy and then longer-term outcomes, also in young women who become pregnant on those products.
Great. Thank you very much, Prof, for that. And Imelda, we hear from Likwa an aspect about cultural issues that really surround pregnant and breastfeeding women. And do you have any thoughts around how we can really work around those, or even work with them in ensuring that we bring, pregnant and breastfeeding women on board into trials, and of course, in the context of considering all of the issues around safety, around data or research integrity that Prof has mentioned?
Thank you, Ntando. You're right. Pregnancy is just generally a sensitive time for women. And then on top of that, if you layer it with the cultural aspects, it becomes a complex issue. So for me, I think researchers have to understand the community. It's important to work within a cultural context, understanding the community you're getting into. One of the challenges we've had in the past with some of the researchers is they just come in a community because there's high incidence. They can easily recruit the number of participants they want, and they just approach the participants without looking at the social networks. So, for instance, right now we're talking about pregnant and breastfeeding women. Who are the influencers, or who is their social network that they rely on for information? What about the relationship issues that also come into play, especially when we look at our setting where a woman, is married and she reports into her husband. So it's important to factor all those issues in. So one of the things that I think a lot of researchers are trying to do now and understand now is that when you're doing research, it's not just the pregnant and breastfeeding woman you're looking at, you're also looking at the setting that she's coming from. So it's either her partner, her mother-in-law. So pregnancy is a time when mothers-in-law play a very critical role. So you want to make sure you engage these people so that they understand, why, it may be important for this woman to participate, in a study. So for me, that's just one thing that I think, is important to factor in. One of the things, I think I saw a comment in there which says that, there are a lot of psychological issues around pregnancy. I think one of the key things that I also realize is that there are modes of communication usually, whether it's, for recruitment. But I think for pregnant women, you want to have that face-to-face interaction so that, you answer their concerns, their questions, and be patient, because we're not just talking about the mother, we're talking about the infant, and there's need to make sure that, you protect the infant. So, WhatsApp may be good to communicate, but face-to-face may be better in this case. I think all those things have to be factored in. Working with your local leadership. Again, if we don't factor in all these things, we run the risk of our research is not going on well. I remember a few years back in one community, again, it was, some of these prep products that were being introduced at the time. The reason why they didn't do so well was not so much that they didn't work. It was because the women were exchanging information amongst themselves within, the rooms that the waiting rooms, giving each other false information, and women were reluctant to then take the products. And this was an oversight on the researchers. They should have been able to figure out that, we need to manage this interface amongst the women. Some women, their husbands or partners were reluctant for them to continue. They were worried about their, partners' reactions. Again, all those things, had this been looked at prior to the start of the study, I think would have done a lot better in ensuring that women would use some of these products. So I just wanted to highlight that it's important to not just work with the actual participant, but take cognizance of the community that they exist in and the social networks that are important.
Indeed, and I mean, participants really are coming from the community. They are not individuals, and therefore all of what we do should be mindful of the context in which they are coming from. And in fact, Busiso agrees with you because he says, I think cultural issues can be partly addressed by robust engagement with community advisory boards, have strong advocates, and also try to recruit pregnant women into the community advisory boards. In fact, Pamela highlights an important aspect of partners and males who need to form part of our engagement and education programs so that they are not left behind in all of these groundbreaking developments. I think all of those really highlighting, in fact, agreeing with what you are saying, Imelda, in terms of the importance of community engagement, not just being to enroll participants, but being mindful of a lot of issues in terms of culture, in terms of the community, in terms of the psychosocial needs that women who are pregnant have, as you noted in your remarks. Now we're encouraging you to raise your hand, like Awelani. I think Awelani's hand is the previous one, but everybody else who would like to join, please just use the virtual hand raise option, or even ask a question like Busiso has done, and also like Nonsikelelo, who is highlighting, who actually says they would like to take a moment to celebrate all of the development that is brought by research, which actually allows pregnant women to make the choice to partake in clinical trials. This is, they remain committed in understanding that the health and safety of women and their unborn babies is made a priority throughout the research, which are things really that Professor has been highlighting here. But most importantly, emphasizing the celebration of more options that are needed, for HIV prevention. Jean is happy about this engagement, that it is informative, and is actually wanting to know the attitude of pharma companies towards enrolling pregnant women in these trials. Are they hesitant? And in fact, how can we work with them to actually do this? And I think that's a point for you to take, Prof. And Nita actually is grateful for this engagement and highlights that together we really need to work and revise our messaging around research and research, because most of the times, or even historically, pregnant women were excluded for safety reasons. So Nita is asking, what strategies or tools are available to communicate this to healthcare workers and the community on, broadly. In fact, as part of our engagement today, we not only have our panelists, we have people who are in different working groups who can actually speak to these questions. We have CAB members, and we also have trial participants who are part of this engagement. And please feel free, would like to hear from you. Again, this is a research literacy networking zone. So there's no formality. Anything that you have that would like to contribute, please bring it on board. Senzo Kuhle says they think in order for women to effectively participate in the psychosocial issues like we have discussed have to be addressed, because pregnancy is a sensitive period, and you touched on that, Imelda. And Manju would actually like to hear from you as one of the people who are very close to all of these programs in terms, Manju is asking if we can talk about community reception to the deliver and be protected studies. And I think that is going for you, Imelda. In fact, I think for Professor as well. So let's take on those and hear what you have to say. Over to you, Professor and Imelda.
Thanks, Ntando. Imelda, is it okay if I go first? Or sorry, I can't keep you off mute.
Network, please go for it.
Okay, thank you. So maybe just to quickly answer the pharma question. So certainly, on these WHO and impact meetings, there was pharma representation, and I think certainly everybody is firmly on board with moving the dial forward and really trying to make progress with making sure that steps are in place to do the work that we need to make sure that these products are safe before we actually, women accidentally become, not accidentally, but what I mean by that is that women become included in research when we really don't have as much information as we potentially would like. And most of the time it's all going to be fine, but obviously it would be better if we could do it in a more kind of structured way. And so certainly pharma was very much on board with that. Perhaps just to discuss some of the components that Manju raised, and then maybe also just to pick up on some of this, some of the comments through the chat. So, I mean, I absolutely agree that I think the community advisory board is essential, but what certainly I found to be very interesting and valuable through the stakeholder engagement meetings for the MTN 042 Deliver study is really how much more kind of nuanced information one can actually get from young women who've potentially been part of these studies or been a male partner to somebody who's been part of the studies. And really just understanding, some of the concerns that people may have about a woman being part of some of these studies. And it's so true that some of these can be very entrenched in cultural beliefs, around any. For example, with the Depivorine ring, insertion of any product into the vagina, and whether it's going to, cause some sort of brain damage to the infant or cause any pregnancy-related problems. And so it's really good to have the opportunity to engage, the community on a kind of broader level and really be able to unpack some of these issues. The other thing that was very, very important and helpful, I think, for 042 is that there was a study called 041, which actually preceded the 042 study, which actually specifically looked at in each of the sites where 042 is being conducted. And just to highlight, it's in Uganda, Zimbabwe, Malawi, and South Africa. Actually looking at, in each of those countries, what sort of factors or support systems were important for women in determining, whether they would want to be part of such a study. And as others have mentioned, it's often the male partner or the husband or the boyfriend. It's quite frequently family members or in-laws. And what's quite interesting too is that one finds quite a diversity between different countries, really, even, so for example, in South Africa, and we held the meeting in inner city Johannesburg, where the study is actually being held. A lot less dependence on a male partner, for example. Women actually drew from friends and other family members for support. But in many of the other countries, certainly a much greater dependence on support from their partners. And so, even those nuances are really important for us to think about different strategies in each country in being able to engage women. And we know that these products benefit women, so that's obviously why we're driven by the importance of what the importance is for women to be interested in it and engage in this research.
Indeed. Imelda, lots to talk about, I think, from your end about the actual practicalities of involving and, in fact, going out to enroll and recruit women into these studies. And I think, leading to all of the discussions, I think things that have really been highlighted, that everyone seems to be clear that this needs to happen. But then, in addition to cultural issues, what are some of the things that we actually have to be very mindful of and be prepared, when we bring on board, in fact, when we work with women, and also to take what you have been, one of the remarks that you had during a discussion, that women should be protected through and not by research. And in fact, women should be empowered, to be able at a community level through the community structures to protect themselves. Do you have any other addition?
Yes, Ntando. So I just wanted to circle back to something that I think would be also very useful to get pregnant women and breastfeeding women to understand and be able to enroll in trials. So part of a strategy that seems to work is just the engagement of local study staff. So they are within that specific community, because then they can help researchers understand the community. How the consenting process can be quite tedious, and I understand researchers want to be transparent. They want to make sure that women have all the information so that they can make an informed decision. I think the other end of it is that because it's so complicated, the language, the scientific language is complicated, sometimes it can be prohibitive. Women will consent without necessarily understanding the reason why they're getting into a study or all the different pieces. So engagement of the local staff is very helpful because it means that they can help with putting across language that resonates with the community without necessarily compromising the integrity of the information. So research information should be packaged in a simplified manner that is accessible to women, so that they can understand and make an informed decision. That's one of the things. And one of the things I had mentioned earlier, active recruitment is necessary, and it has to be direct. I think women want to interface, face-to-face discussion, especially through your prenatal services.
Yeah.
So because that's where they have people they trust, the healthcare providers, for instance. So that's another way that you can use those prenatal appointments. Are so useful in engaging women in the recruitment process, because there's a healthcare provider they trust. You could even use those healthcare providers to be part of the women that translate that information in terms of recruiting. But the other side of it, as we talked about earlier, is that the engagement of critical stakeholders to facilitate support. So your partners, your mothers-in-law, and the community at large, and I think a lot of people have already said it, engagement of the community advisory boards. And if it's a study that engages young people, a youth advisory board. All those are critical to ensure that women are enrolled. I think everyone wants to be engaged at the core. It's not just pregnant women. I think anyone who's going to be involved in some type of research, some type of consultation, at the core, there's an issue of respect. And so for me, that should be the leading factor. Do I respect you enough to want to give you enough information so you can decide what you want?
Yeah.
Women are very capable, just like anyone else, to look at information, assess, and decide, I think I'll take a chance. I think this is good for me. I want to try this. So at the core, there is that. We just need to respect people enough to give them the correct or adequate information for them to make the step forward, whether they proceed to join or enroll or decline.
Wow, they are capable, and
they're
able in many ways. I mean, there's so much that is coming up and a lot more to talk about, but I think what I'm happy about is that these conversations, we all can take them forward into our communities. And I mean, looking at the 117 people, at some point it was 120 people who were part of this discussion. It really shows how important this is. And in fact, I think it's a privilege, even though it's happening virtually. This is probably something that would not have happened had we been all in Germany this week to have this conversation. So I think that's really a great thing. Now, we think we have just about 7 minutes or even 6 minutes before we come to the end of our conversation today, but we are really grateful. We're hearing and we're seeing that there are CAB members. Sis Togo Sifunda is actually agreeing with the importance of being mindful of the cultural issues and barriers. And we really want to thank all of those who have really put their questions. In fact, all of you who have participated in this and those who took time to even write and ask questions. Senzokuhle, Mbali, Toko, Khadija, Awelani, Sizwe, Nontsikelelo, Pamela, Manju, Senzokuhle, Thabo, and in fact, Thabo's hand is up. Thabo, let's give over to you that you have the last take on asking a question, and then we'll have our panelists wrap it up with a few minutes that we'll be having.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon to everybody. I think we've only got, as you said, 7 minutes left, so I'll make it short. I just want to touch on two things that Professor Imelda and Professor Lee actually touched on differently also, but also saying the same things. And just so that people do not take them out of context, because I think we've had such a robust discussion about this in Johannesburg 2 years ago, looking at the MTN delivery study. One thing that Dr. Imelda, Professor Imelda just mentioned now regarding engagement of critical support for the pregnant woman in a clinical study at an early age is actually the core importance of having everybody to have a buy-in and to say something. Professor Lee indicated also that looking at different areas where the studies have been held in South Africa, other parts of Africa, Angola, Uganda, Zimbabwe, there were differences in terms of the influence that was made by partners in deciding whether in a pregnant woman to decide whether they want to be part of a study or not, particularly when they're pregnant. There are issues that I just wanted to highlight that make a whole lot of sense. That combines the two aspects mentioned by Dr. Lee and mentioned by also Professor Imelda. One, we need to be careful, particularly during recruitment, whether we want to only include a pregnant woman or we want to include their partners or their supporting structures in the beginning of the recruitment process. My take on it is that we should be actually looking at having couple consent.
All right, we have just about 3 minutes, and I think we really get the gist of what you're saying, the importance of being mindful of all of these issues that we're talking about. And in fact, we've come to the end of our conversation. Apologies, Phumzile, that we're not going to be able to let you in at this point, but appreciate actually to see how important this subject is for all of us in the field of HIV prevention. I'm going to, at this point, really again thank all of you for coming to this conversation. Thanks to Melissa, who has put this together with Khadija, and thanks to Professor Lee. And now Thabo tells us that we have Professor Imelda Mahaka. So all of you, thank you very much. And I will give you 1 minute to have your closing remarks, a very important parting point for you about on this conversation. Otherwise, we'll take it to the end. Over to you, Imelda and Professor Fairlee.
I guess I can start. I think I'll say what I said again. Women should remain at the heart of this agenda. We should protect women through and not by research. And we need to include women or pregnant and breastfeeding women in clinical trials so that we get the data early enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So from me, I think obviously we all understand the importance of including pregnant women in prevention research. We still need to do it safely. This is possible, and we need to actively move the dial forward so that we do this much quicker and so that we have more product available for pregnant women. And we obviously need to do it together. We need to include the community. We need to include pharma. We need to really do this with a joint effort. And I think also, just in terms of women, we need to include who they want included in the support mechanism. Some women, it will be someone completely different to another woman, and we have to respect that. And although we have a community approach, we do need to also individualize support for every single participant.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Professor. But I see Phumzile is there. Phumzile, you can give us your parting remark. If it's a question, then we will find other ways to answer it. But you can close us out. Just say hello and say your remark and say goodbye and close this session. You're on mute, Phumzile. All right. On that note, we really hoped to have to part with Phumzile's voice, but we probably are experiencing some difficulties. And thank you very much to everybody. This is an agenda that we need to take forward and actually have women at the center of this, and actually including for us as men to really be behind this and not really be at the center of all of this conversation. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good afternoon or a good evening, wherever you are. Thank you very much.